Hey everyone, Dr. Silvermintz back with another Spotlight lecture, and today we'll be discussing Plato's cave allegory. Without question, one of the most famous pieces in all of Western literature and certainly in the history of philosophy. We have in this very brief story a compact version of all of Plato's philosophy within the various symbols of the allegory. In the ancient world, when Plato, by way of his character Socrates, is recounting the story was a lot more shocking than it is today. In the ancient world, in a totalizing society that one would find religious systems dominant, to make the claim that everything you've been taught your entire life is quite shocking. Today, in the 21st century, this is a common trope that we're all quite familiar with by way of various popular depictions of the allegory through the Truman Show or the Matrix, or by way of our battling news stations that each tell us the other station is fake news. We're constantly bombarded with the idea that everything we've been taught our entire life is a lie.
From the moment we are born to the day we die, we are under a spell. We are controlled by the magicians who use marketing and propaganda to manipulate our every thought. From religious leaders to company executives, from politicians to secret military elites, everything we do, say, and even think is scrutinized. Mankind has stepped out of a natural state of existence and walked blindfolded into a world of insanity.
So this trope that everything is a lie is a part of our 21st century ideology itself. And the question is, we're being told that everything is a lie, but what's the truth? Or is there any truth in the world of delusion and illusion, or are there just different stories to be told? Plato, 2,500 years ago, argues that there's some escape out of the world of illusion, and he does so again by way of the various symbols that are encapsulated in the cave allegory. Now, we're told that the story is an allegory, and an allegory is a very specific kind of literary form that needs to be interpreted on two levels. First, we have to understand the literal part of the story. And then once we understand what's going on literally, we can understand and interpret the symbolism of the story as metaphor. So first, let's take a look at the literal story.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day, a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that the prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
So that's the story on the literal level, and Socrates is recounting this story to his young interlocutor Glaucon, and he says, that's a strange story. That's a bizarre people you're telling us about. It's recounted as if this is some sort of cult that has its followers, devotees, trapped, held prisoner, kidnapped in this underground world. And Glaucon is shocked and says, what a strange story. Who are these people? And Socrates says, it is a strange story, and we're the people in the story that are held prisoner. Now, one of the great ironies of this prison is that there are no prison guards. So what in the end is keeping the prisoners trapped in the cave is nothing other than their own desire to stay within the prison. What's keeping them there? This Plato details, by way of his character Socrates, several forces that are keeping the prisoner in the cave, and as well gives us an escape route to get out of the cave. So first, let's look at Socrates' account of the overall significance of the cave. Again, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what it means to escape the cave as well as what it means to be inside the cave. Let's turn to Socrates' breakdown of the meaning of the story.
The cave represents the world perceived by our senses, while the ascent and the contemplation of the things above is the soul's ascension to the intelligible region. The last thing to be seen is the idea of good, the cause for all things just and beautiful. But God alone knows whether or not my dream is true.
Okay, so Socrates there tells us that there are two worlds. The world that we take in with our senses, our five senses, what we see and feel and touch and taste, and the world that we know by way of the mind's eye, the world that we can know by way of intellection or scientific exploration. And the final thing that the prisoner sees, again, part of the metaphor here is that the last thing the prisoner sees is the sun, an ironic image because you can't look at the sun, or at least don't try it at home, right? Perhaps meaning to suggest that this final symbol in the allegory, the good that allows all other things to be, is as hard to see and perceive as looking at the sun itself. You can't look directly at the sun, but yet we know the power and the influence of the sun. And if we do see the sun, we look awry at it. We look by way of the shadows it projects to see what emanates those shadows. Okay, so with that in mind, we know there are these two worlds, and Socrates wants to claim that the real world is the one that we get to with our mind's eye, the one that we can know. And yet, why is that the real one? It not only has a more metaphysical claim to reality, but also a more psychologically liberating role in terms of our own psychology, and that the truth will set us free, whereas our senses and relying on the information we bring in from our senses, our taste and touch, will enslave us. That begins with his account of the significance of the chains. He tells us that the chains that are chaining up the prisoners, again, there are no prison guards in the story. So in what sense are the chains holding the prisoners down? Well, what does he tell us the chains represent? Nothing other than our appetites.
Food and similar pleasures and other gluttonies attach to the soul like leaden weights and turn its vision downwards.
So food, right? Beginning at our earliest birth, from the time of our birth, we become food addicts. We love the taste of food, and the child wants the mother's breast, right? The wants to feel good. And what's wrong with feeling good? Nothing, right? Of course, it feels good to feel good. But the problem is, if we live to eat, if we make that our goal in life, Socrates is telling us it drags us down psychologically. 2,500 years ago, Socrates is giving us an early formulation of the power that food and drink and sex can have in turning the soul and subverting the soul and perverting the soul from its true being, what psychologists today would call a food addict or an alcoholic or a drug addict or a sex addict or a shopaholic or a chocoholic, or any of the various ways that we can be perverted from our true goal in life by being too wedded to pleasure. Do we live to eat, or do we eat to live? We need to eat, and we need to sleep, and we need these things that make us feel good so that we can go on and do our higher calling. So the first step is in our enslavement is this being too committed, too addicted to our feelings, our physical addictions for all the things that make us feel good. And the first step in overcoming that would be to overcome our addictions. Now, the next step in enslaving the prisoners is this whole realm that is obscuring our ability to see things. We said that the cave itself represents the problem of our senses. Well, why is seeing so problematic? Isn't seeing believing? But in the cave allegory, Socrates is telling us that something is getting in the way of our direct apprehension. Something is mediating our ability to see the world. And he describes this as the puppet show. The puppeteers are holding up statues, and that's a very significant detail in the story. They're holding up artificial things, and so then the prisoners in the story are seeing shadow projections of these artificial things. And so let's look at the role that has in our psychological distortion by way of creating false beliefs.
Lovers of beautiful things are living in a dream world. They think they are chasing something real, but how often do things that we think are beautiful turn out to be ugly?
So the influencers, the puppeteers who are projecting these shadows on the back wall of the cave. And today in the 21st century, we're just bombarded by media influences. We can't see anything without the mediations of the media. 24/7, we walk around with a device in our hands with our own cave puppet shadow show that mediates our ability to see things. And Socrates tells us there, we become lovers of beautiful things, and in pursuing beautiful things, right, we, by way of a world of advertising and commercials and a popular culture that glorifies the life of beautiful things, we pursue these things and think that these are the good life. But of course, what happens with everything that we desire in this kind of way, we create that desire for the thing, whether it's a new fashion trend or whatever we think is going to make us happy, and what's this year's fashion trend is next year what not to wear. The beautiful always turns out for Socrates and Plato to be ugly. We think we're getting those good feelings that we're chasing, and we wake up with a hangover the next day or the next year or however long it takes for the high to wear off. And yet we're still stuck in the rat race. We think we want a new drug, a better drug, one that won't make us nervous, wondering what to do, right? But there's some other alternative. The other alternative, though, that Socrates proposes would be a life-transformative one, would be an entire conversion of the soul, an entire turning around, Socrates says, would be required. Because the problem with the prisoner in the cave is that he or she is looking for love in all the wrong places. He keeps chasing a new drug. The answer is to turn around. The problem is once the prisoner turns around and he sees the shadow puppet show and the Insta influencers that are making the puppet show, you would think that he would immediately have this moment of enlightenment. Oh, I've been lied to my whole life. These guys are creating the show. But Socrates says the opposite is the truth, is the reality. That person immediately wants to run back to his position in the cave, to his position of comfort. He's shocked and disturbed and experiences this state of cognitive dissonance. How can you tell me that everything I've been taught my entire life is a lie? Moreover, you want to take away all my creature comforts and tell me that these things that I've been chasing are not the real reality. That's shocking and disturbing at a deep psychological level. So much so that the person would choose slavery over making the difficult ascent out of the cave. And Socrates describes it as difficult. The way up is so rugged. And in fact, the prisoner seems to need somebody else to help yank them and pull them up the steep slope. Of course, you can help to provoke someone, as Socrates does with his interlocutors. But ultimately, the person can choose for themselves whether they want to run back to their position of comfort and to return back to their slavery, or to continue to fight their way out of the cave. Now, what does it mean to get out of the cave? Again, keeping in mind that the world outside the cave is a world of knowing. So even though on the literal level, Socrates is saying the prisoner sees images in water and sees the stars and the planetary objects, that descriptions of looking outside of the cave is only a metaphor. It's in the way that we today use the notion of looking with the mind's eye. What do we mean when we speak of the mind's eye? We're talking about knowing, and that we're getting from Plato himself, that uses seeing as a metaphor for knowing. But knowing something is very different. Now we have a way to assess and analyze better from worse. Inside the cave, we were in the culture war. We were in the war of opinions of which one is more seductive to us. And we're going to be seduced by the most beautiful and latest and greatest and newest and improved. But outside of the cave, it may not be sexy, it may not be seductive, but the truth will set you free. The real reality of things is one for Socrates and Plato that can be investigated with the various scientific disciplines. So when he's talking about looking at the natural bodies of animals and people, and he's talking about the study of biology, and then onto the planetary spheres, the study of astronomy. And ultimately, these various scientific disciplines are going to culminate in what Socrates argues is the highest academic disciplines, from the study of geometry leading to bodies in motion, in physics and astronomy. And then he turns to harmony, the music of the spheres, astronomy that brings the music and shows the harmony behind the cosmological order of the universe. And higher than harmonics is dialectics. What is dialectics? What's going on throughout all of the Platonic dialogues, where Socrates is going back and forth with his discussion partners, asking questions about ethics and psychology. What are we doing here? And what is the ultimate truth of things? Inside the cave, the prisoners think that it's the shadow show, and that it's about producing more seductive images and a more beautiful depiction of those shadows. But outside the cave, Socrates is looking and investigating the truth of human behavior and human life by way of the same scientific rigor that the biologists and the physiologist and the astronomer and the physicist and the cosmologist employ in their various inquiries. And so Socrates does this by way of the notion of form or idea. And so in the most famous example of this, he tells us that in the visible realm, in the realm of the senses, we see all sorts of examples of beds or tables. But how and what allows us to cognize all of these objects that look so different as one single entity, right? Tables appear in different shapes and sizes and are made of different substances. And yet even the child can recognize different looking tables all as a table. That's our ability to cognize with the mind's eye the form of the table. Let's look at that.
We have all seen a multiplicity of different beds or tables with our eyes, and yet all of these different perceptions have one universal form that we apprehend with our mind.
Okay, so our ability to see what Socrates or Plato calls bedness or tableness, the form of the table, the underlying essence that allows all instantiations of a table to exist in the actual world, is the idea of the table, the function of the table. The problem is we can never see that idea. Does it exist? Socrates wants to argue that it exists with more reality than the tables we do see. The tables we do see, of course, had a birth, a generation, and the second that the carpenter nails in the final nail, and the table can function as a table, begins the countdown to its destruction, to its death. It's slowly falling apart. And eventually that table that we can see is on the road to falling apart and decay. And thus, everything we see with our physical eyes is in the process of perishing. And thus, Socrates identifies things that are embodied as stuck in a world of becoming. But the idea of a table was, is, and will always be, whether it was the caveman putting his lunch down on a rock or the force field table that can suspend things even though it has no substance to it, regardless whether it was that rock or the force field table, was, is, and will always be this idea of a table, something that allows things to be supported on its surface and fulfills that function, exists eternally. And thus, Socrates appeals to the most mundane object, the most commonplace thing that you can see or in the room around you. And if in those commonplace things we can find the eternal form, Socrates wants to extrapolate from those commonplace examples that we can start to think about absolute essences for ethical concepts like absolute justice, absolute beauty, absolute goodness. And what allows us to know these forms, Socrates then extrapolates, is the light from the good. Now, what does he mean from the light of the good? Again, here we need to see the allegory. In the realm of the senses, what he depicts is the fire inside the cave. We see things, three things are required for vision to be able to apprehend something. We need eyes that are functioning, an object to be apprehended by the eyes, but the third intermediary substance that allows the eyes to see the object is a source of light. And likewise, Socrates posits that in the intelligible realm, we have the knower, the object being known, and then the third thing, the intermediary, that just like the light allows us to see, the good, he says, allows us to know. And thus, for all things, beauty, justice, and all the other ethical forms, it's the good that allows the inquirer only when the good shines upon the investigation. And he's a bit, again, somewhat mystical about that, in the sense that he can't fully describe the good beyond giving us a metaphor for the good. The escaped prisoner then comes back to the cave, and his fellow prisoners meet him with disdain. He tries to tell the prisoner, his fellow prisoner, he tries, as many of us might feel when we feel like we've seen the truth, or we know the truth, we might say, to help his friends, to help his fellow, friends to also find their way to the truth. And Socrates, in fact, devoted his life to helping other people, to try to encourage them and provoke them and yank them to escape the world of delusion and illusion and to find the truth. And Socrates tells us in his final speech, in his apology speech, in his defense speech during his trial, he tells us the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, a strong condemnation of the life most people are leading, telling us that the only life of freedom that we can achieve is a life that's examined, a life of inquiry, a life where one devotes oneself not to pursuing money and honors and all the other awards and rewards within the cave, but only when one devotes one life to thinking, will the truth set one free? But we'll let Callicles give the final response, because just as many today would dismiss that as being pie in the sky and an ivory tower of understanding, Callicles, 2,400 years ago, one of Socrates' most provocative interlocutors, throws it back in Socrates' face and dismisses philosophy as a waste of time, and not only a waste of time, but even worse, the ruin of somebody's life.
Philosophy is the ruin of any man. If one philosophizes too much, one finds oneself ignorant of everything that makes one successful.
So now we're left with two choices. Socrates tells us that we can escape the cave of illusion and delusion by leading the contemplative life, by leading the examined life, by questioning things, by searching for truth. And Callicles, who dismisses Socrates, who dismisses the theoretical life and says we'll only find our true self by indulging within the various pleasures that are provided for us within the cave. The choice, of course, for all of us is one that we must make for ourselves. We'll see everybody back soon for our next Spotlight lecture.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?